This video is made possible with the help of my lovely patrons. Thank you so much for making this video possible. I also want to thank fellow content creators and educators Olivia Sun from the channel Ali Sunvia, Annie from the channel Aini, and Nicole, who writes for Medium, for sitting down and talking with me about this topic. Go follow them if you're not already. Their links are in the description.
Asian American doll comes with 2 harmless accessories that went through 40 focus groups, an adorable puppy, and a chef's hat.
Wait, is that so she can eat the puppy or something?
So I never really knew how to answer the question, do you eat dogs? Especially since I was first asked this question as a child and knew nothing about the stereotype until I entered elementary school. Of course, my immediate answer was, no, why would you think that? And I'm not alone in this experience. I sat down with fellow East Asian video essayist Annie and Olivia Sun, and they shared similar experiences.
So I brought in food from home, and I think this is like maybe another topic of how like Asian food kind of like, I always feel like shameful to bring food from home because you're like, oh, I wish I had cold sandwiches instead of like all this like delicious dumpling and like whatever food I have. So yeah, I was a bit ashamed, but that definitely started because I brought in food from home, and this kid just like comes up, I don't even know who this kid was, came up to me and he was like, oh, are you eating dog? And I'm like, am I eating dog? I was left too stunned to speak, but I like didn't retort back. But I definitely did feel like so shocked and was so ashamed of like my food, which was completely normal and fine, but it was just labeled as dog.
It's like you also learn to find it funny as a kid, and you're like, ah ha ha, yeah, dog eating, isn't that so funny? Chinese people eat dogs. And I think there's a sense of separation from the Chineseness because it's like, no, I was born in Canada. I'm not like Chinese people, you know, I can still separate myself from the joke. But when I reflect on it again, I mean, it does point to why when I was in school for a long time, I was very embarrassed by bringing lunch to school. I wanted to have like sandwiches and salads and everything else that the white kids would have. I don't know, that the thought of like having a thermos with food in school made me feel like something was off about the food that I was eating. I never searched it up, but I do remember asking my parents when I was younger. I asked them like, oh, is it true that people in China eat dogs? Because, you know, again, growing up here, that's crazy because dogs are a man's best friend. They told me like, yeah, you know, there are some places where they eat dogs, but it's not like they're constantly eating dogs 24/7. I think that hearing that from my parents was a little bit of a shock because the way people posed the question made it sound as if dog eating was something so fundamental to Chinese cuisine when it really isn't.
And for me at least, these jokes and remarks made me want to know more. Do people in China eat dogs, or is it just a myth? As I got older, I learned dog eating is part of Chinese and South Korean as well as other East, South, and Southeast Asian cultures. And I didn't really know how to reconcile these two facts. That calling someone a dog eater of East Asian descent is racist, but that also China and South Korea and other Asian countries do have this culture surrounding dog meat. Whenever I say no, I can't help but feel a little bad, like they eat dogs, but I don't.
Yes, but I don't.
And in the end, what I've come to realize is that this question is purposely made to trap the accused. No matter what you answer, it doesn't matter because the people asking it have no incentive to believe you. You've already lost the game. When I answer no, it's like a plea to the white people in the room to see my humanity. I'm morally equal to you. I uplift the same values. You don't need to feel threatened by me. I'm not like them. So that's what I want to explore in this video. Not only the racial implications of this question, but the moral question. Why is it that in China they can keep dogs as both pets and raise them as food? Why do we in the US look down on them for that? In the end, what's the moral difference between eating a dog versus a chicken or a pig or a cow? Is it the creatures themselves or the people who consume them? Is there such thing as universal morality, or is it all relative? And before I lose you, I'm not here to actually argue a position like eating dogs is good and we should do more of it actually, but rather I want to bring awareness that these questions don't have any singular straightforward responses. I think we like to believe we all have the answers, the perfect moral compass, but in reality these questions are a lot more complex and the answers aren't always black and white. I honestly didn't know anything about this topic before making this video. I always wanted to stay away from this Chinese people eat dogs thing, as it's been so weaponized against Chinese Americans like myself. And to tell you the truth, as someone who was raised in a culture that sees dogs solely as pets, a lot of this research was hard to do, and making this video was hard to do, but I also think it's kind of necessary. This is all to say that I'm going to be talking about a lot of triggering things in this video. I mean, the topic is about eating dogs and animal meat consumption in general, so if anything around that topic bothers you, feel free to click out of the video. So, without further ado, let's get started. So even though one of the most notorious stereotypes of Chinese people is that they eat dogs, I think it's interesting how at the same time they're known for various dog breeds, and how throughout history, dogs in China were seen as part of society, specifically in high society. From the Shar-Pei to the Pekingese to the Shih Tzu to the Chow Chow to the Pug, it seems like Chinese people like dogs. Shar-Peis and Chow Chows were bred as guard dogs, hence their extra fur and scary appearance. Chow Chows even have purple tongues. The Pekingese got its name from being exclusive to the Forbidden Palace in Peking, the former name of Beijing, and were used as slave dogs. They were carried in the sleeves of robes for warmth and protection. The breed was highly esteemed and often reserved for nobility. During the invasion of foreign powers in the 1800s, many of the Pekingese dogs from the Emperor's Palace were taken and brought back to England. This brought the breed to the attention of the Western world, where they gained popularity as exotic pets for the upper class. Eventually, the breed's popularity spread across Europe and North America. The various features of the Pekingese breed, along with the Shar-Pei and Pug, were carefully selected and valued in China. For example, lion-like appearance, as the dog is said to be part lion, their appearance was meant to represent strength, courage, and protectiveness. Golden red fur, the preferred color of the fur, was a symbol of good luck and prosperity. Large expressive eyes. The larger the eyes, the more spirituality they were believed to possess, further enhancing their connection to the divine. A dog is also the 11th symbol of the Chinese zodiac. In Chinese astrology, a dog has a keen sense of justice, valor, and loyalty. Betrayal is not part of their dictionary. They're courageous, helpful, humble, and kind-hearted, with a spirit of selfless dedication and an inviolable conduct of morality. According to the Royal Ontario Museum, dogs are the oldest domesticated animal in ancient China. Confirmed archaeological evidence suggests the earliest domesticated dog in China dates to approximately 9,000 years ago. But here's where things get a little bit more complicated. Dogs weren't just raised to be pets, but also sacrificial and edible. It's been well documented that during the Shang Dynasty, dogs were ritually sacrificed after their owners' deaths to accompany them to the afterlife, as well as used for other religious offerings. But in March 2019, Roderick Campbell, an archaeologist at New York University and co-author Zhipeng Li, an associate professor at the Institute of Archaeology at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing, say that this explanation doesn't fit their findings, which were published in a new study in the journal Archaeological Research in Asia. The team examined Chinese archaeological site reports and about 2,000 Shang-era graves at a site in Xiaomintun, under the modern-day city of Anyang in China. The researchers discovered that the buried canines were predominantly juveniles or puppies. About a third of the graves contained a dead dog in a small pit dug under the coffin. Basically, they found in these middle-class burial pits sacrificed puppies from what today we would consider puppy mills. And that though some of the elite nobility were buried with their dogs as pets, most upper-class people mainly sacrificed dogs during fire rituals along with humans. But the Chinese are far from the only civilization to sacrifice dogs and puppies en masse. The Hittites ritually sacrificed puppies and not adult dogs. These new findings enrich our understanding of sacrifice in the Shang Dynasty. This is a society that has human sacrifices as well as various kinds of animal sacrifice, so the idea of giving a life in ritual is a very familiar one for them. One king, Campbell notes, Wu Ding, who ruled from 1324 BC to 1266 BC, may have sacrificed as many as 15,000 humans, as well as a number of livestock and dogs, an act that he believes augmented the ruler's power as an intermediary between the living and the dead. Later on in Chinese history, as human and animal sacrifices declined during the Han Dynasty, funerary goods reached their peak, where pottery figures of humans and animals were placed in the tombs with the deceased to accompany them in their afterlife. So instead of actual dogs being sacrificed and buried, they would depict dogs on various burial items. As for dogs as a form of food, the Benkao Gangmu, an encyclopedic gathering of medicine, natural history, and Chinese herbology compiled and edited by Li Shizhen and published in the late 16th century during the Ming Dynasty, divided dogs into 3 categories: the Tianzuan, or watchdog, the Feizuan, or barking dog, and the Shizuan, or edible dog. Everything but the liver was considered edible. Here's a short history of dog eating in China according to Hu Yifu, a writer for the site China Dialogue. Prior to the Qin and Han dynasties, the combination of primitive agricultural techniques and the chaos of constant war meant that living standards were low and meat a rare luxury, offered primarily to the elderly as a sign of respect. Beasts of burden and guard dogs which died of illness or old age could not be wasted, so our thrifty ancestors would cook up the meat and eat their fill. But dog meat was not an essential food for people, as can be seen from a study of sacrificial offerings. These offerings to the gods and their ancestors were important, and great attention was paid to the goods to be offered. Today, according to the Royal Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in the UK, it's estimated that at least 10 million dogs are eaten in China every year, but it's far from universally popular. Dog meat is relatively common in certain parts of the country, particularly in the southernmost provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region. According to the China Dialogue, dog fell increasingly out of favor after the Han Dynasty. Philosophical Taoism, which arose in the late Han, saw dogs as unclean, and consumption of dogs was believed to harm efforts to live a simple life. During the Tang and Song dynasties, dog consumption decreased further as the range of available meat increased and stories of faithful dogs and Buddhist ideas of reincarnation spread. And today, according to Humane Society International, most people in China do not eat dog meat. And 2016 opinion polls show that 69.5% have never tried it. It is not part of mainstream Chinese culinary culture. There is a growing animal protection movement in the country that roundly opposes the dog meat trade, and there are frequent documented violent clashes between dog thieves and angry dog owners. In 2015, nearly 9 million Chinese citizens signed in support of a legislative proposal to ban the slaughter of dogs and cats, and more than 10,000 people attended a massive rally in Dalian City. As for South Korea, a 2022 poll taken in South Korea revealed that most South Koreans don't eat dog meat and 56% support a ban. Dog meat is most likely to be consumed by older generations and for perceived health benefits, particularly during Boknao, days of summer. Younger South Koreans are far more likely to shun it. Polls show that the majority of under 30-year-olds in South Korea have never eaten dog meat. Of those under 30 who do eat dogs, the most cited reason is societal pressure, because family members eat it. Despite declining participation in dog meat eating, societal acceptance of others' perceived right to eat it remains relatively strong. It seems as though today the tradition is mostly dying out, however it's still practiced. As for the infamous Yulin Dog Festival, China Daily reports that it doesn't represent mainstream China and in fact was solely created in order to reach growth targets. Local government officials are evaluated by their superiors on GDP growth, but remote and poor regions struggle to meet these growth targets, and the officials responsible are under considerable pressure. This gives rise to various odd money-making schemes, with cultural events designed to boost the local economy a popular choice. According to the Duo Project, whose sole mission is to end dog eating in China, beginning in 2009, this now annual event was initially promoted by dog meat traders and dog meat restaurants in conjunction with the local government as a tourism initiative to drive revenue to an otherwise poor rural city in one of the less prosperous provinces in mainland China. Going back to the China Dialogue, the festival was met with immediate outcry and has since remained an extremely divisive event. Since its inception, there has been a huge amount of domestic and international outcry and support to end the festival, facing off against the fervent support of the local population who defend the festival on grounds of tradition, and the dog meat traders and restaurants who share a vested interest in keeping the festival alive. To me, it seems as though the Yulin Dog Festival was made in direct response to dog eating accusations by the West. They just kind of embrace this stereotype and are like, yeah, we do eat dogs. Come and check it out. In addition, the festival seems to have grown political in that many want the festival to continue in order to push against Western thought encroaching on Chinese culture. Though in the end, the real motivation behind the festival isn't to evoke outrage or to promote tradition, as the festival has only been going on since 2009, but rather it's about money and GDP growth. As China Dialogue states, it's all about the money at the expense of the animals. As the RSPCA says, what is usually underreported is just how controversial and divisive the dog-eating issue is within China itself. In recent years, the festival has often drawn a heated response across the country's vast social media platforms, with strong opinions expressed in the official media too. The domestic backlash against Yulin over the last 3 years has been so significant that it has been deliberately censored from social media sites such as Weibo. Many of the trucks used to transport dogs have also been successfully intercepted by local animal protection groups, and the animals have been rescued. Yulin is only a small part of the picture. What has become more clear year after year is that the central government in Beijing is embarrassed by the dog meat trade in general, as well as the international criticism it attracts. Animal cruelty is increasingly seen by many Chinese as a source of shame and even a major blot on the country's image. It seems as though the majority of modern-day Chinese people and their government want to put dog eating behind them, not only due to international pressure, but because Chinese moral philosophy, that we'll get to later, also pushed for less animal sacrifice and an end to the consumption of dog and animal meat in general. But still, from a Western historical lens, you'd think that people who keep dogs as pets and who domesticated them and who seem to cherish them wouldn't also eat them. And this comes from the fundamental difference between the US and China, where in China they had different classifications of dogs for different things, like we do with fish, for example. Some fish are pets and others are for eating. Whereas in the US, dogs have this special status that though they are animals, we do not eat them. So let's look into the US's history with animal rights and why dogs have achieved the status of the most protected animal in the country. In the early 1800s, Great Britain evangelicals and abolitionists spearheaded the earliest animal protection laws in organized societies, which became a blueprint for dozens of new anti-cruelty laws in America. Social reformers and ministers became attentive to the status of animals during the Second Great Awakening, which occurred from 1790 to 1840, embracing a new theology of free moral agency and human perfectibility. American ministers such as Charles Grandison Finney included animal mercy in their exegesis on upright Christian conduct. Antebellum abolitionists and temperance activists treated animal welfare as a barometer for human morality. Anti-slavery newspapers and novels, most famously Uncle Tom's Cabin from 1852, stressed the indecence of animal abuse among slaveholders and animal kindness among abolitionists. This is specifically because at the time, enslaved people were seen as property and animals. And thus, a lot of the times in these abolitionist circles, they would liken enslaved people to animals and animals to enslaved people and argue that they both should be free and have rights. Animal protectionists believed that creaturely kindness was a marker of advanced civilization, which could rectify a fractured nation and world. Animals were legally defined as property, but Henry Bergh, who founded the ASPCA, introduced watershed legislation that recognized cruelty as an offense to the animal itself, irrespective of ownership. Historian Susan Pearson argues that these laws helped transform American liberalism from a classical conception of rights in the negative to augur the rise of the modern interventionist liberal state. The majority of animal protectionists were affluent, native-born Euro-American Protestants. The animal protection movement faced charges of exclusion and elitism, especially because Teamsters and other targets of prosecution were often immigrants and people of color whose economic survival depended on animal muscle. In a pluralistic society, many humane activists viewed their own class and culturally contingent ideals of kindness as universal when denouncing animal practices different than their own, such as kosher slaughter. When it came to pets and dogs specifically, American colonists kept them for the same reasons they were kept in Europe, for companionship, and in the case of dogs, for protection, hunting, and herding. According to the Christian Europeans, dogs had no souls, nor did any other animal. Even so, the colonists did not look down on dogs, but cared for them deeply. The first law concerning mistreatment of animals or any animal in the English colonies was the regulation against tyranny or cruelty of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1641. Purposeful cruelty toward an animal was punishable by fine or a sentence in the stocks and pillories. Colonists, usually wealthy elite, who bred dogs, took great pride in them and elevated their own above those of their neighbors with collars which were often ornate and, among the upper class, quite expensive. To the colonists, they internalized and replicated this narrative that the nobility championed in Europe, that dogs were companions and friends and were also to be used as status symbols. Dogs to Native Americans generally were highly regarded as a gift from the gods, and although there are many different myths relating on how the dog came to live among human beings, the story of the dog, or Maheo, or Great Medicine from the Cheyenne of the Midwest, is typical. The creator god, Great Medicine, made human beings after creating the world, and showed his people a land covered in fields of corn and thick with herds of buffalo. The Cheyenne appreciated the gifts, but had no means of following the buffalo to hunt them or of transporting the corn once it was harvested. Great Medicine showed them how to capture young wolves and raise them as pets. These animals then evolved into domesticated dogs, who would warn the village of attack, could transport corn, and would help the people track the buffalo as well as hunt other game. In some tribal stories, the dog is among the first creatures created. In others, like the Cheyenne, it is a gift given to make life easier for the people. Dogs were considered intermediaries between the seen and unseen worlds, the realm of the mortals and of the gods, as they embodied both the wild and domestic spheres. This view of the dog contrasted sharply with the European understanding of the dog, whose sole purpose was to serve people. Similar to how European invaders raided the Forbidden Palace to take Chinese dogs back to Europe, the American colonists decided to have their way with the Native American dog population. However, unlike the Chinese dogs, which were kept as pets for European nobility, the colonists decided to interbreed the Native American dog population until the native breeds became extinct. When the colonists arrived, Native American dogs were confiscated, and these dog breeds eventually went extinct from breeding with European dogs, and so thoroughly that it is unclear today what many of these breeds even were. However, there are still pre-contact dogs that have gone mostly unchanged since the 15th century, such as the Inuit sled dog, the Greenland dog, and the Carolina dog. During the 20th century, pets, especially dogs and cats, escalated as subjects of protection. Historian Catherine Greer contends that the growth of a consumer culture of pet keeping, alongside the development of parasite control and antibiotics in the 30s and 40s, enabled people and their pets to live longer, healthier lives together in closer proximity. Dog, as man's best friend and part of the family, was thus born when U.S. capitalists realized pets can be another consumer product to spend money on. By the turn of the century in the U.S., according to the American Pet Products Manufacturers Association, Americans spent $21 billion on their companions in 1996. That number almost doubled in 2007 to $41 billion. To conclude, a mix of capitalism and American Christian values ushered in legislation of the protection of animals, but specifically for dogs. As we've talked about, animal rights groups in the U.S. were primarily made up of wealthy white Christians who wanted to impose their moral rectitude onto people of color and religious minorities like Jewish immigrants for their kosher practices, and of course the Chinese. The protection of animals thus became the perfect justification for moral imperialism and colonization, as well as for xenophobia and racism. Not to mention classism, as lower classes have less access to meat and also depend on animal labor. As we've seen with the Chinese who live in rural areas, they depend on dog meat, as at times they don't have access to morally upstanding meat. While making this video, I talked to Nicole Cooper, an American living in Taiwan, teaching English, and they spoke about how in the U.S., enslaved Africans had to make do with what they had because they weren't given access by their captors to morally upright food, or food in general, and thus created chitlins, or cooked up pig intestine, in order to have meat in their diet. Not to mention frog legs, etc.
Eating frog legs, that's also a thing in the U.S., or also organ meat. So, for example, chitlins or chitterlings, it goes by different names, but those are the small intestines of a pig. And that's very common, especially for Black people, because what a lot of people understand that comfort foods that are like really heavy in the carbs and fats, so like something like heavy curries and stews, and like deep fried food, a lot of that stuff was born out of the poor population. And the reason they're eating these like really heavy foods is because it was during a time where they had very little money, or was during a time of slavery where you don't really know where your next meal is coming. They make all these heavy and deep fried foods to get all their calories in because they don't know when the next meal is coming. So something like pig intestines, that was commonly consumed by Black people during slavery because the food that was given to them was all of what's considered the undesirable parts of the food.
Sometimes we forget that not every person throughout history has lived up to our modern-day Christian moral standards, and that's okay. Rather than try to understand the historical, cultural, and philosophical differences between cultures when it comes to dogs, the white U.S. Christians deemed the Chinese and other non-white races savages deserving of our scorn. And in fact, today, white Americans usually tend to have more sympathy for dogs than people of color, but specifically Black people. In his 2021 journal article, When They See Us, The Great White Awakening to Black Humanity, Gregory S. Parks argues that white people tend to value dogs more because they don't have the intergenerational trauma that Black people do when it comes to their interactions with dogs, as dogs historically were and still are used by police in order to attack Black civilians. Police violence against Black people has been multi-generational. Its roots are racialized and emerged from slavery. Not to mention that white people just tend to interact with dogs more, thus humanizing them further. First, whites tend to own more dogs than Black people. Secondly, whites are more likely to feel protected by dogs than Black people. Historically, there tends to be a large racial and ethnic differences among pet owners. These disparities are especially apparent when considering dog ownership. Whites are about 3 times more likely to own a dog than non-whites, and Blacks are half as likely to own a dog than other people. In 2016, the highest rates of pet ownership was seen in white households with 64.7%. By way of comparison, 36.9% of Black households own dogs. This isn't to say that Black people or people of color just hate dogs, but rather, as Damon Young put it in The Root in 2015, Black people don't hate dogs, we just hate when their lives are valued more than ours. And I think because white people are prone to see dogs as friends and interact with them more, it makes them also more likely to look down on this specific aspect of Chinese history. White Americans feel the need to impose their view of morality onto another culture when they don't even care about other human beings. The U.S. historically, at the UN, has voted to deny food as a basic human right, and they have the audacity to judge people, specifically impoverished people in other countries, for eating dogs. But maybe they are right. Maybe dogs do deserve this special status and are different from other animals and shouldn't be eaten. Let's talk about it. In the last section, we discussed how dogs historically in the US became part of the family as they've been anthropomorphized, made into a status symbol, and are basically given the same status as humans. And that's not wrong per se, but their elevated position in the US is then weaponized against other cultures who do treat dogs more like animals than pets, or who both have dogs as pets and also eat them or sacrifice them, or again, eat them as a source of food. And this doesn't just include China, though East Asian cultures are who we in the US associate the most with dog meat consumption, but also against other societies, who, like China, are able to see dogs as both companions and food. Some of the earliest records of Native American tribes eating dogs come from Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery ate over 200 dogs bought from Native Americans. Lewis and the members of the expedition ate dog meat, except William Clark, who reportedly could not bring himself to eat dogs. And this practice became yet another reason to bring Christian morals to these so-called savages. However, today in the US, Native American tribes are allowed to kill dogs for religious ceremonies, but I'd say most non-Native Christians would find that abhorrent or at least immoral. And dogs aren't the only pets that are consumed around the world. Wild guinea pigs are eaten by rural farmers in Brazil on occasion and are trapped and hunted by dogs. Of course, this isn't common among the larger population, but they do eat an animal deemed as a pet in the US, but is seen as food to a minority of people in Brazil. But like fish, there are different species of guinea pig. There are the wild ones and the domesticated. One you eat, the other is a pet. But this stereotype that people in East Asia eat their pets seems to stick most particularly to China, because China isn't an ally of the US, and thus there is more incentive to remain hostile to them and their practices, even if the practices are rare and are dying out. And that's honestly what I really take issue with, because in the end, dogs are still just animals, right? And dogs being more special than other animals is just a social construct. It's highly subjective from culture to culture, but American Christianity demands that lines be drawn, which is why in the US today, we can't include dogs as both pets and food. And by trying to impose this Christian capitalist moral hierarchy, it just leads to a justification for racism and xenophobia. But let's talk about it. Maybe dogs are more special. Maybe they're smarter and thus deserve more rights. Well, in reality, they seem to be just as smart as cows, and we still eat them, right? Dogs score higher in perceived intelligence ratings than cows, for example. Yet a study in the 70s demonstrated that in a test, cows could navigate a maze as well as dogs, and only slightly less well than children. So it's not that dogs are smarter or more sentient than other animals, but rather our familiarity with dogs and how we're socialized to view them has changed our perception of them. The fact that they can sleep in our beds, can go on walks, that we grow up with this societal narrative that they're man's best friend and a companion, thus this all makes it so hard for us in the US to believe that people eat them. Our attitudes to animals tend to reflect the familiarity we have with them. Because we're so familiar with dogs, it's harder to accept their deaths than animals that humans are less likely to interact with. When's the last time you interacted with a pig or a cow? Or a chicken? When's the last time you interacted with a goose being force-fed for foie gras, which is still legal in the US, by the way? Dairy farmers love their cows, but most of the US population who still eat meat don't seem to moralize that because they don't interact with cows that much. And as Nicole said in our interview, people in Muslim countries don't eat pork, and people who follow the Hindu religion may not eat beef because cows are seen as sacred, but they're not trying to push their morality onto us, so why should we push Christian values onto others? This is all to say that modern day people, specifically people in the US, are primed to see dogs as special because of how we're brought up to see them, and the animals we deem for consumption are kept far away from us. And whatever society you're brought up in, you're taught to see those cultural norms as normal and are less likely to question them and are more likely to see them as superior. In France, escargot and foie gras are delicacies and treasured parts of French cuisine, but we don't see all French people as barbaric because of that. And that's because we in the US are not socialized to view ducks or geese or snails as special and part of the family. We lack a familiarity with them. However, it's not just a lack of familiarity, but also, again, there's a racist incentive to demonize the Chinese and East Asia for eating dogs. In order to maintain white supremacy, we need to vilify other non-white groups to maintain our moral rectitude and righteousness and justify imperialism and colonialism, etc. In the end, it just depends on who's consuming the food that we deem one a delicacy and the other immoral and worthy of our condemnation. That we decide to judge an entire country and population rather than seeing them as complex individuals with their own unique culture and history. But it's important to remember that dogs are just animals, and that's how we'll be discussing them in the next section about the killing and consumption of non-human animals. So in this section, I want to talk about the debate on whether animals have a right to life through both Chinese and Western philosophy and moral thought. So let's start with China. According to Deborah Cow's article, Animals in the Traditional Chinese Thought, published in the Routledge Handbook of Religion and Animal Ethics in 2018, in traditional Chinese thought, humans and animals are part of the moral universe of exemplary humans, who should be models of benevolence and compassion, and such compassion and benevolence extend beyond humans to other life forms in nature. There is no strict delineation to distinguish animals and humans, as both are considered part of the cosmos, in contrast to Western philosophical thoughts. One of the most important and enduring ideas in traditional Chinese philosophy is the notion of Ran Tian He Yi, humans and heaven as one, or humans and nature as one. The human and animal worlds lie in a continuum, with no firm or essential divisions between the two. By and large, in traditional Chinese thought, animals are considered to assume a normative standing. In philosopher Professor Donald N. Blakely's paper entitled Listening to the Animals, The Confucian View of Animal Welfare, he also argues that animals have specific normative standing and a range of prescriptions that apply to them. They are beings who deserve to be treated according to their nature, including the way in which they develop and function. Harm, as this may involve pain, stress, deprivation, death, wastage, or disregard, conflicts with such goals. As an imperative of virtue, a concern for animal welfare is grounded solidly in the ontology and cosmology of the Confucian tradition. As Mengzi, a Chinese Confucian philosopher who is seen only second to Confucius himself, states, "The superior man is so affected by animals that having seen them alive, he cannot bear to see them die. Having heard their cries, he cannot bear to eat their flesh." It's important to remember that Confucianism became state-mandated under the Han Dynasty, the same dynasty in which dog sacrifices and presence in burial pits waned. Whereas in previous eras in China, such as the Shang, animal and human sacrifices were deeply ingrained in the culture. In addition, during the Han period, Mahayana Buddhism, the most prominent branch of Buddhism in China today, was introduced, and Mahayana Buddhism preaches vegetarianism. Buddha clearly stated, which can be found in the Lankavatara Sutra, "Since all sentient beings are equal to me as my only son, how can I approve my followers to eat the flesh of my son? Eating meat to me is out of the question, and I will never approve that. I have strictly condemned eating meat in every way." Today, according to Pew Research Center, Buddhism is the most common religious identity in China, yet few people identify as Buddhist. Just 4% of Chinese adults, or 42 million people, formally identify as Buddhist, and only 10% identify with any religion, according to the 2018 Chinese General Social Survey. In the last imperial dynasty known as the Qing, ruled by the Manchus from Inner Mongolia, they believed in protecting dogs, and dogs were even legendary figures. The Chinese Academy of Sciences says the Manchus abstained from killing dogs, eating dogs, and wearing dog skin hats. In addition, they did not allow the guests with dog skin hats into their houses. It is said that this behavior came out of the respect for dogs and could be attributed to the story of dogs' rescuing of Narachi. In the legend, the king of Han, Narachi, once got into danger, and it was a dog that saved him and helped him escape with bare life. As the acknowledgement of the dog's contribution to rescuing, Narachi gave the order, "In the mountains, there are so many kinds of animals which you can hunt for food, but from now on, no one is allowed to eat dogs nor wear dog skin. When dogs die, they should be buried because dogs can read man's emotions and can rescue their masters. Dogs are loyal." From now on, loving dogs and respecting dogs became the custom of Manchu nationality. So as you can see, with each point in history, dogs were seen differently. But there seemed to be a general agreement towards the turn of the century that dogs were mainly for pets, hunting, and guarding, and only sometimes consumed in times of hardship and scarcity. In all, because there doesn't seem to be a moral or philosophical strict delineation between animals and humans, they are the same and should be treated well, and under Confucian and Buddhist ideals, shouldn't be eaten, but in the practical world are. As for Western moral thought, we first need to start out with the right to life. The right to life is the belief that all humans and non-human animals have the right to exist. However, this right to life is threatened when it comes to the death penalty, abortion, and of course, the ethical consumption of non-human animals. If we agree that non-human animals have a right to life, who are we to take it away? In addition, what requirements does a non-human animal need to possess a right to life? Up until recently, the consumption of non-human animals hasn't really been a moral philosophical concern, but rather just a fact of nature. According to Greek philosopher Aristotle, there is a natural hierarchy of living beings. While plants, animals, and human beings are all capable of taking in nutrition and growing, only animals and human beings are capable of conscious experience. Human beings are superior to animals because human beings have the capacity for using reason to guide their conduct, while animals lack this ability and must instead rely on instinct. Thus, the function of animals is to serve the needs of human beings. Following Aristotle, the Christian philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas argues that since only human beings are rational and are capable of determining their actions, they are the only beings towards which we should extend concern for their own sake. Thus, the consumption of non-human animals requires no further moral justification. During the 1600s, René Descartes argued that animals might act as if they're conscious, but really are not, as sentience is a basic requirement for non-human animals to have a right to life. Animals to Descartes act in a mechanical sense, and don't produce language, and therefore aren't really conscious. Descartes was aware that some animals make sounds that might be thought to constitute speech, such as parrots' requests for food, but argued that these utterances are mere mechanically induced behaviors. Only human beings can engage in the kind of speech that is spontaneous and expresses thoughts. In the 1700s, Immanuel Kant believed that though both animals and human beings have desires that can compel them to action, only human beings are capable of standing back from their desires and choosing which course of action to take. Since animals lack a will, they are not autonomous. Since animals have no wills at all, they cannot have good wills. Therefore, they do not have any intrinsic value, and we do not need to bother ourselves about them. In the 1990s, British-American philosopher and University of Maryland professor Peter Carruthers concluded that in order to have conscious experiences, one must be able to have higher-order thoughts. However, we have no reason to believe that animals have higher-order thoughts, and thus no reason to believe that they are conscious. But he believed that how we as humans treat animals does matter because it reflects how we treat other humans. Such acts as torturing a cat for fun, for instance, are wrong because they are cruel. They betray an indifference to suffering that may manifest itself with that person's dealings with other rational agents. So although the action may not infringe on any rights, it remains wrong independently of its effects on any animal lover. On the other side of the debate is that animals are sentient and are conscious and do have a right to life, and that we should concern ourselves with them. The argument in support of the claim that animals have direct moral status is rather simple. It goes as follows. If a being is sentient, it has direct moral status. Most animals are sentient. Therefore, most animals have a direct moral status. And here is where Australian moral philosopher and professor at Princeton, Peter Singer, comes in. During the 1970s, he wrote in Animal Liberation that the killing of animals for the consumption of their meat should be seen as immoral and a violation of their right to life. He holds that rights should be based on sentience rather than species membership. Mahayana Buddhism also preaches sentientism as a reason why animals shouldn't be killed for human consumption. More recently, in a 2020 Phil Paper survey of 1,812 published English-language philosophers found that 48% said it was permissible to eat animals in ordinary circumstances, while 45% said it was not. And generally, even though veganism and vegetarianism is more well known and plant-based alternatives are growing in the US, according to a 2019 Gallup poll, only 4% of the population is vegetarian and only 1% are vegan. Gallup found that half of Americans were familiar with plant alternative meat products, and 4 in 10 have tried them. Americans who reported a reduction in their meat consumption typically cited health and environmental reasons for doing so, but these changes have not been met with an increase in Americans' adoption of vegetarian or vegan diets, as less than 5% of U.S. adults follow either eating approach. So non-human animal meat consumption in the U.S. is still pretty common as long as it's not dogs. In the end, Professor Tom Regan, who championed animal rights theory in the 1980s, argued that justification of eating animal meat lies not on the shoulders of those who are vegetarians, but on the shoulders of those who are not. It is the non-vegetarian who must show us how he can be justified in eating meat, when he knows that in order to do so, an animal has to be killed. It is the non-vegetarian who must show us his manner of life does not contribute to practices which systematically ignore the right to life which animals possess. So if we go along with Peter Singer and Tom Regan's philosophy, then we have to face the moral truth that we should all really be vegetarians or vegan because animals are sentient and have a right to life. But if we follow Aristotle, Kant, and Descartes, animals are not for our moral concern and aren't sentient anyway, nor are they part of our species, so we can just go ahead and not concern ourselves with them. You can choose what value system to believe in. Who am I, a meat eater, to tell you what's right and what's wrong? And this brings me to the question, does universal morality even exist? In general, a concept of morality among humans does exist, but humans have never at any point in time ever 100% agreed on what is good, on what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, etc. Of course, to those in the US, eating a dog is abhorrent and wrong and cruel, but in countries like China and South Korea, not so much. And this leads us to moral relativism. Moral judgments are true or false, and actions are right or wrong only relative to some particular standpoint, usually the moral framework of a specific community. No standpoint can be proved objectively superior to any other, and therefore we shouldn't pass judgment on those who do consume dogs and, more generally, animals. And though that sounds nice, moral relativism does have its pitfalls. An argument against moral relativism is the relativist advocacy of tolerance is morally misguided since not everything should be tolerated. Should we tolerate the killing of animals no matter how humane? Should we tolerate a society and culture that is okay with eating animals that are almost universally also kept as pets? Have we arrived at a moral truth that we shouldn't eat and kill animals? And I'd say if we do decide to take up this position that it is morally wrong to kill and eat animals, we need to apply this argument equally no matter the race of the society, but that's not something that we can viably do in the current world that we live in, where there are some groups who deem themselves superior to others. That's not to say that we can't judge individuals or societies for their practices or personally think that their customs are wrong, but should we use these cultural differences as justifications for proving that we're superior to them. I personally don't think so, because if we do that, we're climbing up a very slippery slope to supremacist ideology, and that's proven to be really dangerous. What I find the most interesting out of all of this is how various human societies have given moral values to different plants or animals. Even in modern times, we have superfoods and meat covered in gold that leads to contentious debate. Should that even exist? Obviously, humans have never come to a consensus on consumption and slaughtering of animals, but I want to emphasize here how the consumption of dogs as bad has been used to demonize the Chinese and other East Asian groups, when in the end, it's a culture clash that will never be resolved, and that's okay. There doesn't always need to be this obvious moral high ground, because, again, if we do think that there is a right or wrong answer, that can lead us down a dark path if we're not careful. And just a quick note before we conclude, I didn't cover if there's a moral difference between eating an animal after they've died of natural causes versus killing for food, even though those are legally two different accusations. Like, for example, in Brazil, it's legal to eat dog meat, but you can't kill a dog. I also didn't talk about the torture of animals, including the killing of them, because in general, in the current fast farming industry, most animals are treated horribly, so the torture of animals, I felt, is kind of irrelevant, as it's just naturally part of the killing process, unfortunately. If we're going to say we shouldn't kill any type of animal, I also don't think we should torture it. You don't need to be a vegetarian or vegan to be moral, but I do think taking another animal's life, no matter what the purpose is still immoral, because they do have a right to life, and you're taking it away no matter how humanely or inhumanely you do it, which is again why I didn't include the torturing of animals in this debate. I'm aware I didn't cover these 2 points, but that's just for the sake of argument, or else I'd be here all day, and none of us want that, do we? In part 2, I gave a small counter argument as to why dogs should have this special classification, and that is because, maybe dogs are more sentient, are smarter than other animals. But not only has that been debunked, but also just because an animal is more sentient than other animals doesn't mean that it has more of a right to live, does it? If a non-living human animal has the will to live and wants to actively avoid suffering, it shouldn't matter if one is smarter than the other, both should live. And what makes an animal smarter than another? That's kind of arbitrary, isn't it? Just because one animal can go through a maze and the other can't, so what? Are we going to put all the animals on Earth through a maze to see if they should be deemed as food? I overall find this argument that dogs are smarter and therefore should be more protected as pretty weak. However, as I was thinking of counter-arguments as to why dogs are intrinsically more special than cows or chickens or pigs, the only one that I could somewhat see is that dogs were the first, if not one of the first animals to be a companion to humans, to be trained as guard animals, as herd animals, as pets, and that it couldn't really be any other animal. It had to be dogs, so therefore dogs are special. Biologically, dogs are perfect human companions. They're soft, strong, trusting, loyal, etc. But did we make them that way, or were they always like that? Could it have also been cats? And though most dogs are obedient, some dogs aren't and have cold or indifferent personalities towards their owners. If we domesticated chickens as pets, would dogs as food not cause an international outcry? This is all to say that even though dogs might be special in the fact that they were one of the first domesticated animals, that doesn't mean that other animals don't possess the same qualities or couldn't have evolved into companions as pets if we lived in an alternate reality. In the end, though I can see this as a good defense of dogs being off the table, I also think that the animal humans chose could also be arbitrary. But I still don't really know. I don't have any time machine that could go back and change wolves to, cows. Could chickens be bred to guard and be obedient? I don't know. Could our loyal companions only have been dogs? Could they have only come from wolves? And do you think that's a good explanation as to why dogs shouldn't be consumed as food or shouldn't be seen as food? Let me know what you think down below. The don't you eat dogs question is an extremely loaded one, as you can see if you've watched this entire video. It not only comes from white supremacy and is racist in nature, as it's used to dehumanize the accused, But it also is a moral judgment. My moral compass is better than yours, and therefore I am right and you're wrong. But as we've discussed, it's not as simple as that. There's historical and cultural differences, there's racist incentives to keep this moral hierarchy intact, and lastly, there's never been a period in history where universal moral truths pertain to all groups of people. And though moral relativism has its shortcomings, I think it's the best way to answer this question because we live in a society where there's a white supremacist hierarchy that intentionally disrespects non-white cultures as a way to justify that supremacy. Not all races and cultures are given an equal treatment. This isn't to say that eating dogs is good, actually, but rather we need to work to understand why that practice exists and not use it as a way to invalidate East Asian cultures just because you might not understand it. That doesn't mean that you have to agree, however, but rather the world is vast and human history is complicated. And who are we to pass a moral judgment when most of us are still consuming animals and buying into factory farming? Personally, I do believe that all animals have a right to life and that we shouldn't consume them, but my actions are contradictory as I still eat meat. And I have no answer as to why I do that, and there is no moral justification for it. Making this video was incredibly tough, and I'm sure watching it was incredibly tough, especially if you made it to the end. But even so, I hope that you learned something new, and that, being uncomfortable sometimes is okay and a good thing. Let me know what you think about this video down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I'm thinking about doing more videos about East Asia, specifically about looking at documentaries made about East Asia, specifically China and North Korea. Documentaries that are made from a Western lens like American Factory or One Child Nation or State of Mind, and talk about if they uphold our established beliefs of these countries or if they try to disrupt them. Let me know if you're interested in seeing that video, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.